Yes. So I will speak. I have more slides than the time allows, I assume. So I really don't feel obligated to do everything that is in the slideshow. Feel free to stop me whenever you would like to elaborate. I will be happy to see how you connect things to organizational psychology, organizational behavior, or whatever you have in mind. Any questions before I start? Okay. Down? Okay. So I will introduce you to meta-reasoning and consider in particular potentially misleading factors for self-assessment while performing reasoning tasks, and I will explain what reasoning tasks are. Overall, starting at the broad picture, I'm the head of the graduate programs of Behavioral and Management Sciences at the Technion, at the Faculty of Industrial Engineering and Management. Our program includes cognitive psychology together with human factors engineering, organizational behavior, and behavioral marketing. I'm in the group of cognitive psychology, and overall we teach graduate programs that combine, sorry, this is our website. I didn't know there is a link there. I will close it. Okay. Okay. We combine the three topics in our programs for graduate programs. For graduate students, we have master's degrees and doctoral degrees. In the undergraduate programs in the Faculty of Industrial Engineering, we teach behavioral courses to engineers. In particular, I teach human factors engineering and data science students how to collect data from people. Cognition and metacognition. The traditional context in which metacognition has been studied is learning. In particular, it was developed originally by memory researchers, which means that they focused on memorizing processes. They had in mind the context of information that flows something from somewhere in the world, either from the computer or from paper or whatever, from people. And we would like to have this information well organized in our memory system. This is what they had in mind. The idea, Nelson and Aaron, since the seminal paper from 1990, they came up with the concept of monitoring and control. These are the basic metacognitive processes. The idea is that while we memorize, this is what they had in mind, we all the time monitor our progress, and we ask ourselves, how well will I perform on a test? A recall test or recognition test. This is what they had in mind. And this monitoring, in fact, hides what we know in reality. We don't have access to our actual knowledge, but we have access only to our monitoring, the subjective assessment of our chance of success. And this subjective chance of success guides our control decisions, which are the acts that we perform in light of our monitoring. If we expect ourselves to succeed, then we decide to stop studying. If we expect ourselves not to succeed and we would like to have the motivation to succeed more, then we continue investing effort. These are examples of controlled decisions. They are not only those. It can be also activate a strategy, change a strategy, ask for help from some external resource, people, internet, whatever. So the basic processes happen all the time in parallel to the cognitive processes that are typically considered in cognitive psychology, which means that while you listen to me now, your metacognitive processes lead you to consider the relevance of the information, the chance that you will be able to use these new terms that I now teach you, and you might take an action like nodding, that you follow me, or frowning, that you don't agree. These are metacognitive control decisions as well. Any questions so far? Okay. Overview of this talk, introduction to metacognition. It will be very brief, focusing on meta-reasoning. I will explain what it means. I will focus this talk on the basis for self-assessments, these monitoring processes, with the main claim that self-assessments are reliable to the extent that the cues people rely on are reliable, which means that people rely on heuristic cues, and if these cues happen to be reliable, then the monitoring will be reliable, otherwise it will be biased. I will introduce these terms and then go into some examples, empirical examples, mostly from my research, but not only, demonstrating individual differences, effect on monitoring and biases, task by item interactions. And if we will have time, I will get to the metacognition of an ill-defined task, which is rarely studied, and media effects on problem solving, screen versus paper. Introduction, brief introduction to metacognition. Traditionally, the metacognitive research is focused on learning, mainly memorization, as I mentioned, and also answering knowledge questions by retrieval. As I said, memory researchers deal with inserting information into memory and retrieval information from memory. The name of the domain, the subdomain, since I'm going to refer to other tasks as well, is called meta-memory. Although when I submit papers to some of the journals, when I have to choose the keywords, sometimes I will find metacognition and sometimes I will find only meta-memory, which is problematic. Typically, I write to the editors and ask to add more types of metacognition. Considering effort regulation in more complex tasks provides new insight. This is my overarching message in my research. In particular, reading tasks, it's a topic, non-topic, which is called metacomprehension, but much smaller than the meta-memory research. And I'm part of the team which establishes the research in metacognition of reasoning and problem solving, and we called this subdomain meta-reasoning. This paper, the Ackerman and Thompson 2017, is a Trends in Cognitive Science invited paper which introduces the framework and is focused on the open questions, which are numerous, because it's a new domain. So in a new domain, we could then just delimit the gaps, and there are a lot of gaps. Questions so far about the distinction between the subdomains? Okay. Classical experimental paradigm in problem solving. This is the compound remote associates task, or RAT, if you remote associate tasks, it's the same, almost the same. Participants get an empty screen. They press the present button, and then they get 3 words. And the task is to find a 4th word which generates a compound word or a phrase with each of the 3 words. What is the answer? Any idea?
Cheese.
Yes, correct. Thank you. Okay. So this is an easy item. I have a collection of items in various levels of difficulty. Typically, I aim to have items in the difficulty range of 20% success rate, which is the hardest items, and 80%, which are the easiest items, in order to have room for variability across participants. The participants type in the word, they press continue, and immediately after they assess their confidence by dragging an arrow along the scale, expressing how sure are you that the answer is correct. Of course, this is just one example of a task. I like this task because I measure response time, and the response time here is dedicated mostly to thinking, because reading is minimal. There is no much of a challenge to process the input, unlike several other tasks. With this task, I can have the following direct measures. I have the final confidence, the response time between the present and the continue button press, and of course, success rate in each of the problems. Typically, I have 30 items in such a test, and it takes about 20 minutes to 30 minutes to solve. Then I can triangulate the 3 measures. Confidence to success rates allow me to examine how accurate is the confidence. So to what extent does it reflect actual success rate? Time to success rates allows me to examine efficiency, how much time people invest in order to achieve a certain level of success. And response time to confidence allow me to examine effort regulation, which means when they stop investing effort, how much confidence they have. And this is actually the central part in my research these days, although I will not elaborate about it a lot in this talk, but a little bit. So this triangulation of measures is the core input that we have as researchers, and each researcher can, of course, focus on different aspects. Additional reasoning tasks that you can find in the literature, syllogisms are very common in reasoning research, less so in meta-reasoning, but there is meta-reasoning research with them as well. Analogies, like in psychometric tests of Israel, for example, in Bailey's thesis, we use these analogies. Cognitive reflection test is the famous bat and ball, and several more items from Ackerman and Frederick originally. These are misleading math problems. The solution that comes up to mind immediately is 10, while the correct solution is 5. And this allows to examine, Ackerman used it to examine system 1, system 2, and the intervention between them. We use them to study the monitoring and control. My colleague, Valerie Thompson, she came up with the idea that the link between system 1 and system 2 is the metacognitive judgment or feeling of rightness regarding the first solution that comes to mind. So we refer to the process of activating system 2, the more deliberate and effortful processes, by metacognitive monitoring and control. The activation of system 2 is a controlled decision. Raven matrices, again, from psychometric tests, It's a multiple choice test with 8 options. I used it to parallel our reasoning tasks to web search, which also show 8 options. And we have just published 2020 a paper which shows or demonstrates how we perceive web search as solving a multiple choice problem with 8 options. Number series is a task I just start to work with, but it should work the same as per the principles of monitoring and control in meta-reasoning. And we are going to study with it math anxiety and compare it to verbal tasks. Any questions? Okay. The basic reasoning process, our first writing about the meta-reasoning framework was in a chapter in 2015, in which we delineated this process. At first, people get the components of a problem. They identify the goal of the problem and the components presented to them. Then they start looking into the problem and consider whether they can solve it or not. If they have a first solution that comes to mind, like in the bat and ball problem, we have the 10 immediately and we are happy with it, then we stop there. But if we doubt our, this immediate solution that comes to mind, then we sit to struggle with our system 2 processes. We might engage in this effortful thinking that might be time-consuming. And then we scratch our head and consider whether the solution we have now is the correct one or have high enough chance to be correct. And in this, we finish working on a problem and move on to the next problem. These are the cognitive processes of reasoning, which are quite well agreed on among the reasoning researchers. The meta-reasoning processes are hypothesized to bridge between these stages. Each stage is connected to the next one by a metacognitive monitoring and a control decision to continue, which means that if I think the problem is not solvable, I will stop there. If I have to fix my car engine, then I stop immediately. I will not try to engage in this problem. I will go to the garage. But if I think the problem is solvable, then I engage. I might come up with a first solution that comes to mind, which is accompanied by this judgment, which is called feeling of rightness. If it's high, then I stop. If it's low, then I activate system 2. Then I have some trials to solve the problem. I consider whether I'm confident enough to provide this solution, which might go through several times, change a strategy again and again, until I decide that this is my final answer and I have my final confidence in my answer. And then I click next and go to the next problem. Any questions about this? Okay. In the TICS paper, the Trends in Cognitive Science paper, we developed the framework further, and we had this illustration. The schematic timeline goes downwards. The basic cognitive processes of reasoning appear here, in which please note that we do not obligate to a certain separation or certain order, and on purpose we put here the rectangles a little bit overlapping in order to keep it open for those who, there is a huge debate whether the initial response is produced before and produced and could be provided before the analytic process or not, or if they go hand by hand and inform each other. we do not get into this debate. We assume that the initial autonomous response at least starts to be produced earlier than the analytic process, and there is the answer choice at the end. In parallel, along the timeline, there are the metacognitive monitoring and metacognitive control processes. The monitoring types now in this paper already include 6 types. Those are the 4 that were there originally, and we added, given studies that published between the 2 papers, the feeling of errors and the final judgment of solvability. And the metacognitive control methods are parallel on the timeline. The first decision that follows from the initial judgment of solvability is whether to engage or give up on this problem. The feeling of rightness regarding the first solution that comes to mind guides the decision to provide or reconsider or to change a strategy. The intermediate confidence, while we engage in the effortful process of system 2, guides whether the actual allocation of time, changing strategy, and the decision to provide the answer or answer by don't know or seeking help, options that are hardly studied. And final confidence, feeling of error, and final judgment of solvability guide us what to do with the best answer that we could provide. We have empirical support for the connections between monitoring and control in this combination. We have empirical support for initial judgment of solvability to guide giving up and response time. We have evidence for intermediate confidence to guide allocation of time and the decision to answer by don't know or choose to respond by a concrete answer, and the final confidence as well. We also have empirical support for the association between the initial judgment of solvability, the first feeling that this problem is solvable or not, that affects uniquely above and beyond other cues, the final decision whether this problem is solvable or not, after we force them to get engaged in the problem, even if they thought it's not solvable in the first place. And we found that if they thought it's not solvable in the first place, they will invest less time and will have higher chance to think that it's not solvable even after engaging in the problem. Questions?
לי יש שאלה, היי רקפת, תודה. אני רוצה לשאול, פשוט יש אנשים individual differences נגיד באימפולסיביטי. אז אנשים אימפולסיביים אני לא רואה שהם בטוחים יותר או פחות, הם מנהלים איזה מטה-קוגניציה, הם פשוט עונים, הם בסיסטם 1 יותר, ואני לא בטוחה אם יש שם סיסטם 2, כי הם לא, אני לא חושבת שהם יותר או בטוחים בהחלטה שלהם, האנשים שהם לא אימפולסיביים.
Okay, I don't have empirical evidence about this particular type of people, but it's worth examining. The assumption is that everybody has.
Everybody is like the metacognitive.
Of course, even very young children, everybody. And the question is whether they monitor well and whether the association between monitoring and control is perfect, which in young and healthy adults, typically what we find with memory-related processes is almost perfect association between monitoring and the decisions. We found it even in second-grade children, almost perfect, 0.9 something correlation. But I work on highlighting situations in which young and healthy adults do have disturbance. In particular, when we compare between computer and paper work on learning and on problem solving, we find in computers reduction in this strong association, but also in other situations. So it's an empirical issue to consider the strength of association between monitoring and control.
Okay, תודה.
Thank you for the question. Any other questions? Thoughts about the context that you have in mind in your research? Okay. So today I will focus in my talk on metacognitive monitoring. And the main question is, how do people infer their chance for success? The idea is that we don't have really access to our knowledge. And then, given this assumption, we base our judgments on heuristic cues, which guides the question what factors may affect our monitoring of the chance of success. And if they affect our monitoring, then they also may bias the monitoring. So if we consider a particular heuristic cue, then we should consider whether the strength of predictive value of this heuristic cue for actual accuracy and for confidence is in match or correspondence between the two. We will try to find situation in which the heuristic cue has fluctuations in its utilization for the confidence or any other judgment, while in fact it doesn't affect the accuracy, or vice versa, that it affects accuracy, it predicts accuracy, but it doesn't predict confidence adequately. These double dissociations that we aim to find demonstrate how the cue utilization, it's called, what factors affect the judgment inappropriately and might generate a bias. So this is the concept of the methodology that we use in order to discover what factors affect and may bias meta-reasoning judgments or metacognitive judgments in general. Questions about this? Okay. In a review paper, I delineated the ideas in a framework or a list of factors that affecting the judgments. I discriminated between self-perception, in which individual differences get here into this group of cues, how you perceive yourself above and beyond the current item you attempt to solve. The task characteristics, how people perceive open versus closed test type, for example. I will show a demonstration of such empirical evidence. Incentives, what motivates people, how they perceive this motivation. Time pressure, what happens, for example, in math anxiety, time pressure is a central issue that I don't know about the population you mentioned, but maybe it's a relevant cue as well. And the context, the situation within in which the task is performed, in particular, I compared screen versus paper work, which should not affect the interaction between the item and the person, and yet, of course, it affects, otherwise it would not be interesting. The next level is the experience during performing a particular task item, and the leading experience that has been studied is fluency, the perceived ease of processing, but there are more familiarity, concreteness, accessibility, and other heuristic cues at the item level. So I distinguish between the self-perception, which is detached from the current item that I cope with. Task characteristic is the current collection of items and experience of item by item. All these inform the inference of the judgment, the metacognitive monitoring. And of course, there are potential interactions among them, which I will show you some examples for. Questions about it? Okay. The illustration at the side is a present I got from students in the metacognition course, like 2 or 3 years ago. They said that all these biasing factors makes us look like this, that we look at ourselves and this is how we perceive ourselves. So this is a joke. So far I went through briefly about introduction to metacognition and basis for self-assessment, with the main claim that if people utilize reliable cues, then their monitoring will be reliable, but if they base their monitoring on not so reliable cues, then the monitoring will be biased. And now I will go to empirical examples, and I will also provide you with some methodological comments, which I think might be relevant to other research domains. Questions so far? Okay. So I will go by the groups of cues. First, self-perception. You might know Dunning et al. I will go through it briefly. Here, this study, it's a classic study about self-perception. Undergraduates were asked to assess their expected score at the entrance to a course exam relative to their peers, which means not their own absolute value of score, but in which quartile in their class they are going to be with their course exam. And this is the result. We can see here at the x-axis the actual performance quartile, and the black line, the diagonal black line, indicates the optimal assessment that they should have if they were accurate. But what we see, in fact, is here the lines represent the ratings which they assessed themselves. We clearly see that people perceive themselves in a narrow range of percentiles, and they all think that they are above the average. Everybody thinks, even the weakest students in class think that they're above the half of the class. And we see the severe overconfidence among the weak students, which is termed doubly cursed. Not only that they don't know the materials, they don't acknowledge their lack of knowledge. This is the classic finding by Dunning. It's called sometimes Dunning-Kruger effect. So this is a very, very classic finding. And the materials here were course materials. Recently, a study by Pennycock and colleagues found the very same pattern with the cognitive reflection test, the bat and ball set of misleading problems. We see here, they did very much the same. They had quartiles, and they asked people how many of the questions you are going to solve correctly relative to the sample, and we see exactly the same pattern in the lab. So this is an example of individual differences and these important problems with the weakest students in class or in the sample. Questions?
רקפת, אבל אולי זו התמודדות דווקא טובה דווקא של האנשים החלשים, שהם דווקא מפעילים את הקוגניציה, ואומרים דווקא אני אגיד שאני אצליח, ואולי הסיכוי זה כמו לחזק את עצמי, כמו נבואה שמגשימה את עצמה, אז אולי מפעילים פה דווקא את הקוגניציה אפילו יותר ברמה יותר גבוהה דווקא.
Okay, so the question is whether people, it might be self-approval or something like that, encouraging to think that I'm not the worst in class. However, it might be correct as per motivational aspects, and I don't deny this option. The question is whether people who see themselves above the average are motivated to get improved. This is the main dependent variable in this situation, and I don't have correct or reliable empirical evidence regarding it, but it's worth examining. It might be that there are two aspects. One, which is if you would think that you are the worst in class and this would be discouraging, and then you will stop trying, then you are right that it's motivating to think that you have some chance to be in a reasonable score among your peers. So,
yeah, especially if I invested time learning to the test. So it's before the examination. So maybe I invested many hours. So I want to be optimistic about it.
Yes, yes. It could have potential advantages as per motivating people who are weak. Yes, you are right. Okay. Another example is from Bailey's master thesis. We still work on this study, but I wanted to bring it just as illustration of a very nice collaboration with Liat Levontin. Some of you might know her. She's from marketing and social psychology. And Bailey who is here, went to two of us and wanted to merge our research domains, and we were very happy about it. And she brought the insight of mindset, or the principle of mindset, into my research. I typically do not study individual differences, but this is a very nice example of how we can learn from each other. So we had an online sample of participants who solved these analogies and rated their confidence in each solution. We had three groups: a control group who submitted everything, one group that could provide an answer, rate their confidence, and then say, I prefer to say don't know, rather than provide this answer, and another group who could say just the title on the button was different. Rather than saying, I don't know, you could say skip. And our hypothesis was that it's harder for people to say, I don't know, than to skip. In particular, we compared people with fixed mindset to people with a growth mindset. And so at the end, we examined theories of intelligence, whether you believe that intelligence is malleable and can develop by engaging in challenging cognitive tasks, or you think that that intelligence is innate and whatever you have, this is what you have to cope with. And we found that the upper panel is accuracy, and the x-axis is the mindset, the continuum of mindset. We see some performance differences, but this is not the main point. We see overall that the fixed mindset at the right-hand side have a little bit higher success rates than the growth mindset, but this is negligible. The main point is the confidence, which is the lower panel. We see here the two groups of don't know and control condition with growth mindset have very high confidence, overconfidence here, while the fixed mindset was reflected better actual accuracy. And the interesting part is the skip condition. Please note the entire difference between don't know and skip is what was written on the button, whether don't know or skip. We see that the don't know was the same as the control condition, who had to submit everything, while the skip condition changed the direction altogether. We see here that those in the skip condition were more modest in their confidence and in fact were more well calibrated. The skip condition eliminated the overconfidence that these growth mindset people suffered from. So it's just an example of the way we can take a cognitive study, a metacognitive study, and integrate it with individual differences measures and consider and see who are the people who can benefit from conditions that allow less overconfidence. And we see here that if you only write on the button skip rather than don't know, then it attenuates the overconfidence of those in growth mindset. So our conclusion is that the option to skip protected growth mindset participants from biased confidence. Any questions about this study? Okay. If you have input afterwards, Bailey will have to hear. She is now preparing her thesis talk and writes her thesis. Okay. So we talked about self-perception now, individual differences, and the next example I would like to bring is about test type and fluency and interaction between them. Fluency. Fluency is a ubiquitous cue found everywhere. It's dominated the research in heuristic cues utilization for many years. We can find it in judgment and decision making. We can find it in meta-memory. The idea is that quick judgments or quick responses are accompanied by high confidence, higher than the judgment that is provided after lengthy thinking. For example, if we answer knowledge questions, the questions that we know the answer for very quickly, we are highly confident in the answers. And if it takes us longer to answer a general knowledge question, then even after this time, we are less confident. This is well established across many, many tasks. The question is, what is going on with meta-reasoning, with the deliberate and effortful process of solving challenging problems? We focus here on task characteristics and experience during task performance and on fluency. In this case, we operationalized fluency by response latency, which is very common in the literature. We see here a study with those CRT problems, cognitive reflection test, the bat and the ball. I have a collection of 12 problems, and they were used in this master thesis by Hagar Zalmanov. We compared here these questions when people had to type in their answers to a condition in which they had to choose among 4 options. We see here the red line is the actual success rate in the multiple choice test format. The x-axis is response time. So these are the quicker responses, these are the slower responses, and we see a negative slope, although mild, but a negative slope. This is an indication that fluency predicts accuracy. The response time predicts the actual chance of success. And there is a negative correlation here. However, with the free entry, we see no correlation between time and actual chance of success, which means that if you invested 40 seconds, you will have 40% chance of success. And also, if you invested almost 2 minutes, again, you have 40% to succeed in solving the problem. it's legitimate to assume that the easier problems are responded more quickly and the more challenging items are responded more slowly. But we see that in this case, fluency does not predict accuracy. So we have a dissociation here between the test format allows us to change the pattern of predictive value of time for accuracy. And the main question that bothers me is how the confidence pattern looks like. Whether there is a difference in the slopes that reflects the validity of the fluency as a predictor of success, and whether there is an absolute difference that reflects that in multiple choice test format, we have higher chance to be correct overall, more than the open-ended test format. So now we are going to see the lines for confidence and see whether they match the lines for accuracy. These are the lines for confidence. Overall, we see a very high overconfidence. The mean of overconfidence is 40% in this case. And we see that there is no difference in the slope and no difference in the height, the absolute height of confidence between the conditions. So from this research, we conclude that in both cases, regardless of the association between fluency and accuracy, fluency predicts confidence with a negative correlation. It's a typical finding. This study demonstrates a much broader phenomena that people underestimate the effects of task characteristics and take more effect on their judgments by the experience during task performance, item by item. Overall, we see that fluency is a persistent cue for confidence. Questions about it? What can a researcher do when there is a match between judgment and performance? I talked all the time about the dissociations, about different effects between the cue and the accuracy and the cue and confidence. But with this task, the compound remote associates these word triplets, 3 words that you have to find a 4th word that matches each one of them. We found here a beautiful match between actual chance for success, which is the whole line, and confidence in their association with response latency. So you could think that in this case, fluency predicts accuracy reliably, and at the same time, it predicts confidence reliably, and people are just accurate in assessing when they are correct or wrong. If this would be the situation, then we would expect that every correct answer will have higher confidence than every wrong answer. Moreover, if it's so reliable, then we should have 100% confidence in a correct answer and 0 confidence in a wrong answer. And this should not be connected to the response latency. In order to examine that, we split the data by accuracy, the same data. I'm just splitting the same data. Now the correct responses are here, and we see that they were provided more quickly than the wrong answers. Of course, when I split into the correct and wrong answers, response latency does not predict accuracy. There is no way it can predict. But the question is, what about confidence? Is the confidence for any correct answer is 100% and 0 for each wrong answer, or confidence is affected by fluency? And this is the answer. We see that as people respond more slowly, their confidence drops with the time. So still, confidence is affected by the response latency or fluency, while even when we dissociate the two and accuracy cannot be predicted by fluency in this data analysis. Still, we see that confidence is overall higher for the correct responses than for the wrong responses, which is a good message to convey, but still it is biased here by 40%, here by 20% underconfidence. And the difference between them is 40% rather than 100%. So fluency is, again, a persistent cue for confidence. Question? Thoughts about other situations? Okay. So we talked so far about what metacognition is, about basis for self-assessment, a bit about the individual differences, and demonstrated task-by-item interaction. Now, I can go still on both studies, or we can have discussion. Just let me know your preference. Do you want me to continue, or you want to...
אני אשמח אם תמשיכי באמת.
Okay. טוב. Any other requests? Okay. Metacognition of an ill-defined task. So far, we discussed only well-defined tasks. There was one correct solution for each problem that we had, and this is the classic context for metacognitive research. But in this study, we took the challenge of addressing ill-defined tasks. When we consider such a new framework from 2017, all the time we have to ask ourselves what else. In addition to this complex process, what we eliminated and should be added to this figure. And in particular, in this study, we considered judgment of originality as yet another monitoring type. I'm going to tell you about a study that was done with 3 students. LCD led the study. She is now a faculty member in the Open University. Ilan Turgovitsky is a PhD student still. And Daniela Soibelman, who actually originated this study in the first place, she finished her master thesis already. And Ella Meron-Spector, some of you might know her. She's an organizational psychology, and she did a psychologist. She's now in Paris, in Seattle, in France. It's not Paris, actually, a suburb of Paris. And she studies creativity. And again, a student, Daniela Soibelman, she merged 2 researchers within our group. Ella was in our group at that time. And this is a beautiful collaboration as well. Creativity, these are aspects of the timeline of creativity. And we focused on fluency. Please note that fluency here has a different meaning. It means how many ideas somebody come up with when asked to provide original ideas, and originality and novelty. So we focus on the initial ideation process. And it's a novel study in metacognition because of the fact that we had an open, absolutely open task, ill-defined task. We used the divergent thinking task in which an object is presented to the participants, and we ask them to write possible uses for this given object. We had 9 objects, and participants should write down whatever they think that can be done with this object. Our question, or our research plan. Originality is a relative measure. by definition, original is relative to something else, typically compared to other people or to other ideas. Typically, people are asked about originality as a subjective measure. In order to turn it into the metacognitive domain, we had to have also an objective measure of originality. We used the actual percentage of the sample that produced each idea. It was a lot of work to assess. It was written by typing in free text, and we had to assess the ideas, and we assessed what was the actual rate of each idea within the sample. And this was the objective measure of originality, and we compared it to a subjective assessment of originality. And we asked the participants to assess explicitly what is the rate of how many among 100 peers will produce this, or typically, or produced in our sample this specific idea. This was the originality judgment as a metacognitive judgment, which could compare to the objective measure. Typically, originality is assessed regarding other ideas. In the literature, you will find that experts assess the originality of other people. For example, there are studies about movie makers, that people give an idea of a new movie they would like to produce, and domain experts assess the originality of their ideas. But here, we talk about self-assessment of originality. And if we think about it, all of us, while we do research, must assess our originality of each research idea that we come up with. When we had this idea, we thought it's highly original. Nobody studied before originality from a metacognitive angle. We must do it in order to know how novel are our ideas as researchers. A classic finding in the literature of creativity is the serial order effect. If people produce a list of ideas to an object, their early ideas are more common in the sample, which means they are less original. Please note that the scale is upside down, so the common, it's commonality, the scale, at the top of the scale, and rarity at the lower end of the scale. So original ideas are low in this scale. Later ideas in the list within a particular object is typically producing, people typically produce the more rare ideas after producing some common ideas. So this is the serial order effect. Later ideas in the list are more original. Our research questions. First, are originality judgments sensitive to the serial order effect? Second, are they reliable? Do they reflect overestimation like confidence ratings typically do, or underestimation? And are subjective and objective originality judgments affected by the same factor? In this framework, we talk about the experience during task performing, mainly. And in the first experiment, our goal was to examine the serial order effect. We explored how people judge originality of their own ideas. We used the divergent thinking task, and the participants rated how many participants in percentage came up with this use. This is actual originality score. The early ideas of the participants were found among 40% of the population, and the later ideas it is a median split for each participant for each object. And we see that the later ideas were more original. this is the serial order effect. It's a replication of a classic finding. The question is, where are the judgments of originality? Do they reflect overestimation or underestimation? And this is the line of originality judgments. What we see here is that there is a slope, so the early ideas are assessed as less original or more common in the sample than the later ideas. But we also see the gap, and the gap reflects underassessment because they thought that their ideas are much more common in the population than they were in fact, which is an interesting finding, which is new to the literature, because we see that people think that their ideas are less original than they in fact are, which means that we might miss very good ideas because we think that they are obvious. Ella just a minute, Ella just published this week a paper for the public in INSEAD. She wrote a brief article about this finding. Yes.
זה נראה לי קשור אולי ל-reflection bias, שאנחנו חושבים, שאנשים חושבים כמונו. אם אנחנו חושבים, אז גם אחרים חושבים, אז אפשר...
This is exactly what we thought, that people think that they're similar to others, and the ideas that they have are common to others. This is exactly the explanation we give. Thank you. So, are the judgments sensitive to the serial order effect? Yes, they do. Are they reliable? Not so much. They suffer from underassessment. And now we turn to ask whether the objective and subjective originality affected by the same factors. And I will not elaborate about it, but we had 2 additional experiments in this paper. In the first one, we gave in the instructions an anchor that most people gave 2 ideas per object or 6 ideas per object for another group. And this affected their performance, the number of ideas that they came up with, but did not affect the judgment of originality. In the third experiment, we gave them in the instructions only feedback, which was false feedback. We either said that their ideas are very original or that their ideas are very common in the sample. And this affected the judgments, but not the actual originality performance. So we see here a double dissociation between performance and originality judgments because they are affected by different factors. So they are not affected by the same factors, there is a double dissociation. Questions about it? Okay. So I see in this study a much broader message than the dissociation itself. It demonstrates how to study ill-defined tasks with metacognitive tools, and this is a novel contribution. Okay. Final study or discussion? What do you prefer?
רגע, לי יש שאלה.
כן.
סליחה, שאני כל הזמן.
בכיף, כן.
עד עכשיו עשית משימות שאפשר לבדוק את ה-accuracy, או אפשר לבדוק judgments about the accuracy, אבל אם יש לי decision under uncertainty, שממש לקבל החלטה שאין לנו מושג מה הפתרון, אז את חושבת שאני גם יכולה להשתמש ב-judgments של מה אחרים חושבים?
The question is your aim. If you would like to compare 2 situations in a judgment, you can do it even if you do not know how to assess accuracy. But if you would like to examine the reliability of the judgment, you must compare it to something which is robust and agreed with the participants that this is what they have to judge. Otherwise, if you give students a task to generate a creative design for a web page, for example. Then there is no strict or common agreed upon criteria how to assess the quality of the web page. So it will be hard to examine their bias. There is no bias because you don't know what exactly you have to assess. So in order to examine what factors affect differently success and judgment, you must have a concrete and agreed upon measure with the participants what you are going to assess and how. Okay, this is a limitation in this research domain because you must have something to compare to. I now struggle with a study about difficulty of a task. How do you define difficulty? The question is whether to define it as the feeling of difficulty or effort or something vague like that, or to ask people how many of your peers are going to succeed in this task. And this is a concrete measure because I can compare to actual success rate in the sample. Okay? Okay. So, discussion or another study?
לי יש...
כן.
את בודקת גם כמה מוטיבציה יש לאנשים לענות? כי הרי אומרים שמערכת שנייה דורש השקעה, וגם, ולא תמיד אתה רוצה להשקיע, אז אולי גם זה משפיע.
Thank you for the question. The question is about the effect of motivation. I don't have here data about it, but I have studies in which we manipulated motivation by points and by monetary incentives and bonuses. And overall, the patterns are not much affected. People typically invest longer time when we manipulate the motivation to be high, but they don't succeed much more, and the judgment pattern is not much affected as well. So sometimes the judgment goes up a bit, but not substantially, and the patterns are kept consistent. Surprisingly, sometimes people provide answers with 20% confidence, even under a strong motivation to success. I'm going to teach about it this week in the metacognition class. Yes, it's quite amazing.
למה את חושבת שזה קורה?
I didn't include here, but I have a model, the diminishing criterion model, which deals with effort regulation. My claim in a line of research is that as people invest longer in a task, they have high motivation to go on to the next item. And this high motivation to go on to the next items leads them to continue despite having low confidence. So there is a time limit beyond which people are not willing to invest further in a task, and they just stop with whatever confidence they have at that point of time and continue. I will be happy to share papers. It's a whole line of research. I can share papers about it. Okay, I think I will finish. Just click here. To sum up, we study meta-reasoning. It's a brand new domain. Today I talked about what factors underlie the judgment. As I mentioned, there are additional aspects that are studied. As a group, we are about 40 researchers now, the leading researchers and their students. We study what judgments take place. As I mentioned, we must consider whether there are additional judgments, what other factors underlie the judgments, what are the stopping rules. As I mentioned, effort regulation is when people decide to stop and move on to the next item. This is the topic Ilanit just asked me about. How does this metacognitive analysis support delving into cognitive processes? Does it feed back to understand cognitive processes? And the answer is certainly yes. Individual differences and the holy grail is performance improvement. How can we guide people to improve either performance or efficiency, the use of their time? And we are in a very initial stage regarding it. We must address this question much more enthusiastically. We are now bothered more by the more basic research, but I would like to go to the more applied research of improvement of performance. So overall, we ask ourselves, what else? What else in each of these questions? And if you are interested, there is a website of the community of meta reasoning. You are free to go there. All the papers I know of appear there, and researchers that study these topics appear there. You are welcome to visit this webpage. That's it. Thank you. I hope you learned a bit about misleading factors for self-assessment while performing reasoning tasks.
תודה רקפת. רקפת, אם את מוכנה לחלק את השקפים, אנחנו...
טוב, תודה.
בשמחה, שמחתי לפרוש. כל טוב.
ביי, יום טוב.
יום טוב, ביי ביי.